Xavier walked the narrow alleyway with the steady rhythm of a man who had long since learned to avoid trouble. The night was still, heavy with the kind of oppressive silence that only a city could hold in the dark hours. His footsteps echoed off the cracked pavement as he passed the towering buildings, their shadows stretching like fingers across the street. The smell of grease from the corner diner and the faint scent of rain that never quite fell lingered in the air. The evening had been long, filled with the monotony of the retail world, and Xavier just wanted to get home. He had worked double shifts at the local convenience store, managing the register, cleaning the aisles, and facing the daily hostility of the few customers who wandered in at odd hours. In the city, people rarely looked at each other, too busy, too tired, too absorbed in their own struggles. But as Xavier moved further into the alley, he felt the weight of eyes on him. It started as a gut feeling, a cold prickle on the back of his neck, and then his senses sharpened. He slowed, his gaze sweeping the alley, trying to identify the source of the discomfort. That's when he saw them, a group of men huddled together at the far end of the alley. Their laughter was coarse, too loud, the kind that echoed with malice rather than joy. The flickering light from a nearby street lamp illuminated their faces as they looked up, eyes narrowing when they saw Xavier. The leader of the group was a tall, scruffy man with a jagged scar running down his left cheek. His gaze was predatory, sizing Xavier up. His hands were covered in tattoos, dark and sprawling, symbols Xavier instinctively didn't trust. It was clear they were trouble, the kind of trouble that didn't just want to fight, but wanted to make a statement. "Hey you," the man called, his voice carrying through the stillness. "What are you doing here, huh?" Xavier felt a flicker of unease but refused to show it. He had been in situations like this before. He kept his expression neutral, his voice calm, just passing through. "Nothing to see here." The man smirked, his eyes shifting to the others behind him, who were now circling, blocking any way out. "I don't think so," the leader said, taking a few steps toward Xavier, his boots scraping against the ground. "I think you're lost, my friend. This part of town isn't safe for people like you." Xavier's jaw tightened at the implication, but he didn't react. He knew exactly what this was, another encounter with people who thought they had the right to dictate who belonged where. He'd been a target before more than once simply because of his skin. It was something he had learned to endure, like an old wound that never fully healed. One of the men laughed, a low, derisive sound. "Yeah, we don't want your kind here. You're in the wrong neighborhood." The words hit harder than Xavier liked to admit, but he kept his cool. He had long ago mastered the art of walking away from fights, of not letting the ignorance of others dictate his actions. But as he began to back up slowly, keeping his distance, one of the men in the group, a younger guy no more than 20, took a step forward. His eyes were wild, filled with a mixture of fear and aggression. "You think you can just walk away from us?" The younger man sneered, his hand moving to his waistband. "You're gonna pay for thinking you're better than us." Xavier's mind was already calculating his escape. He could have run, but the alley was a dead end. His only option was to stand firm. He reached for his phone, thinking of calling the cops, but before he could pull it out, the leader moved quickly, his arm outstretched, shoving Xavier hard in the chest. Xavier stumbled back, feeling the weight of the shove, but his balance held steady. He took a deep breath, his fists clenched at his sides. There were 5 of them now, and they were closing in. His heart pounded, but he didn't show the fear they were hoping for. He had learned long ago that fear was a weapon, and he refused to give them that satisfaction. "You're gonna regret this," the leader said, his voice cold with malice. Just as the group began to press forward, something happened that made them stop in their tracks. The leader's eyes fell on Xavier's neck. There, partially hidden beneath his jacket, was the faint outline of a tattoo, a symbol that seemed to pulse with an energy all its own. It was intricate, ancient in design, with swirling lines and jagged edges. It looked almost like a seal, but there was something about it that felt different, as if it held a power far beyond anything they understood. The gang leader froze, his breath catching in his throat. His hand trembled slightly as he pointed at the tattoo, his voice suddenly betraying a flicker of panic. What is that?" he stammered, his eyes widening. "Where did you get that?" The rest of the gang followed his gaze, their expressions shifting from aggression to confusion, then fear. They exchanged uneasy glances, as if the sight of that tattoo had triggered something they weren't prepared to face. Xavier stood still, his gaze hardening. He could feel the change in the air, the shift in their energy from one of violence to trepidation. The symbols on his neck, passed down through generations, had a legacy that no one alive today fully understood. It was an ancient mark, one tied to the bloodline of warriors who had once been feared across the world. Xavier didn't need to say a word. The fear in their eyes told him everything. The gang hesitated, their tense stances faltering as they continued to stare at Xavier's tattoo. There was a palpable shift in the air, the tension thickening as though the very space around them had changed. The leader, Jake, took a cautious step forward, his eyes glued to the intricate design on Xavier's neck. His voice trembled slightly as he asked, "What is that? Where did you get it?" Xavier didn't respond immediately, sensing that his silence was creating an unsettling effect on the group. He could see the confusion, the flicker of fear in their eyes, and the way they now kept their distance. His tattoo had always been a part of him, something passed down from his ancestors, but he had never truly understood its significance until now. The symbols were ancient, written in a script no one alive truly knew anymore. They were the remnants of a lineage lost to history, a connection to warriors whose feats had been passed down only in whispers. His mother had told him stories when he was young, though she had never fully explained why the mark was so important. She had only ever said one thing that Xavier still remembered clearly: "This is your inheritance. Protect it, and it will protect you." Jake, still staring at the glowing tattoo, seemed to come to some sort of realization. His face went pale as his mouth worked, trying to form words. "No, can't be," he muttered. He looked to his gang members, his voice dropping to a fearful whisper. "This is one of them. The descendants." Xavier watched them closely, his calm demeanor betraying the storm brewing inside. He had heard the stories, too. His ancestors were believed to have vanished centuries ago, their power too great for the world of men to comprehend. Legends spoke of warriors with extraordinary strength, speed, and skill, the kind of power that could bend the course of battle and history itself. But those warriors had disappeared long before Xavier's time, relegated to myth and superstition. "What are you talking about?" one of the gang members asked, his voice shaky. "You mean like the ancient warriors?" Jake's eyes were wide now, his gaze never leaving the tattoo. His voice dropped to a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon something. "You don't know, do you? Those symbols. They're from the vanguard, the bloodline of the warriors who protected the world from the shadows. They were feared, and they disappeared without a trace. But if you're one of them, if you're a descendant..." Xavier's chest tightened. He had heard these myths, these stories told in hushed tones. His mother had never confirmed them, never told him more than the basics. But now, standing here, facing this gang of racist thugs who had been so sure of their power, Xavier could feel the weight of his ancestry pressing down on him. "I don't know what you're talking about," Xavier finally said, his voice low but firm. "But this tattoo means something to me. It's part of my bloodline, something my family has carried for generations. And I don't have time to explain it to people who think violence will solve their problems." Jake's eyes flickered with uncertainty. He seemed to waver, but the other men were still on edge. One of them, a burly man with a rough beard, muttered, "We can't just let him go, Jake. What if he's really one of them? What if he..." Jake cut him off with a sharp gesture. "No. No more," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I don't want any part of this anymore." For a long moment, the gang stood there, shifting uncomfortably. The tension remained thick, but they were no longer the aggressors. Xavier's calm presence, combined with the power they now feared in the tattoo, had caused them to second-guess their intentions. They began to pull back, the fear of the unknown outweighing their desire to intimidate. Xavier could feel their retreat, their confidence crumbling in the face of something they didn't understand. He wasn't sure what kind of power his ancestors had wielded, But standing there, in the face of their fear, he felt a strange, growing confidence that perhaps the tattoo was more than just ink on skin. It was a reminder of who he was, of what he carried inside him. As the gang members slowly began to back away, their expressions shifting from hostility to fear, Xavier stood his ground, unshaken. He didn't need to fight. He didn't need to explain. His silence, his presence was enough. "You better walk away," Xavier said finally, his voice unwavering. "You don't want to mess with something you don't understand." Jake swallowed hard, his eyes darting from Xavier's face to the tattoo and back again. With a final glance, he turned and motioned for his gang to leave, the sense of fear still hanging in the air like a cloud. As they disappeared into the night, Xavier let out a slow breath. For the first time in a long while, he felt as if he had just begun to understand the power of the mark on his skin. The danger wasn't just in the tattoo. It was in what it represented. And it was something that he would have to learn to control. Xavier's footsteps echoed in the empty hallways of his apartment building as he made his way up to the second floor. He could feel the remnants of the confrontation from the alley still swirling in his chest. The encounter with the gang had rattled him more than he cared to admit. He wasn't afraid, not exactly, but there was something about the way they had reacted to his tattoo that unsettled him. Fear had taken root in their eyes. Not just fear of him, but something deeper, something ancient. It wasn't until he stepped into his small, dimly lit apartment that the full weight of the situation hit him. He locked the door behind him and tossed his keys on the counter, but his mind kept returning to that symbol, the one that had been etched into his skin for as long as he could remember, the one his mother had never fully explained. Sitting on his couch, Xavier ran his hand over his neck, feeling the faint vibrations beneath his fingertips. The tattoo had always been there, but today it felt different. It hummed with energy, an almost imperceptible buzz against his skin. He could feel it more clearly now than ever before, as if something was awakening inside him. His mind drifted back to the conversations his mother had shared with him when he was younger, her cryptic words about his heritage, about the power that flowed through his bloodline. She had always been evasive, never fully explaining the significance of the tattoo or the bloodline it marked. "When the time comes, you'll know what it means," she told him. But now, for the first time, Xavier wondered if that time had arrived. The apartment felt too small, too suffocating as the buzzing in his veins grew louder. He stood up abruptly, the urge to move coursing through him like a sudden surge of adrenaline. There was no mistaking it. Something was changing inside him. He needed answers. He stripped off his shirt and stood in front of the mirror, his eyes narrowing at the tattoo. The symbols seemed to shimmer faintly, like they were alive, shifting and pulsing with energy. His reflection, though familiar, seemed distant somehow, as though the man in the mirror wasn't quite him anymore. As Xavier stared at the tattoo, his thoughts began to clear, and memories he hadn't realized were buried deep inside him started to surface. Flashes of images, ancient cities, battlefields, warriors clad in armor, flitted through his mind. The sounds of clashing swords and roaring crowds echoed in his ears. He was aware of the bloodline, but now he felt it, the power coursing through his veins, a connection to something far greater than his own existence. The images grew clearer, more defined, and he found himself standing in the midst of one of those battlefields. He could feel the weight of a sword in his hand, the grip familiar as if he had held it 1,000 times before. His body moved with fluid precision, instinct guiding every motion. He struck down enemies with ease, the battle unfolding around him like a well-rehearsed dance. This wasn't just a dream. It was a memory, a visceral connection to the warriors his ancestors had been. Xavier staggered back from the mirror, his chest heaving as the visions faded. The power was real. He had felt it, tasted it. But what did it mean? What was he supposed to do with it? His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He fumbled to answer it, his fingers still trembling. It was his mother. Xavier, her voice was tight, strained. "I don't know what happened, but you need to be careful. The tattoo, the symbol on your neck, it's drawing attention. People are going to come looking for you. And you're not ready. Mom, what's happening? Xavier asked, his heart pounding. What is all of this? Why didn't you tell me sooner? There was a long pause before she spoke again, her voice quieter now. I was trying to protect you, Xavier. You're not just any man. That symbol represents something far greater, something powerful. It's your legacy, but it's also dangerous. There are people who want to use it for their own gain. And you're the last of us. Xavier's mind raced. The last? He could feel the weight of her words, the gravity of what he was being told. There was a legacy inside him, something he had only begun to understand. But now he wasn't sure if he was ready to carry it. Stay alert, son, his mother added, her voice trembling. The world is about to change for you. And for all of us. Xavier hung up, his mind spinning. The weight of his bloodline, the power he now realized he carried, felt heavier than ever. The buzzing beneath his skin had grown louder, more insistent. There was no turning back now. He was just beginning to awaken to a truth he had never known, and the world was about to find out who he really was. The city was silent under the glow of the streetlights, the kind of quiet that made every sound stand out like a hammer striking stone. Xavier moved through the dark streets, his senses heightened, each footstep echoing in his ears. He could feel the change within him, the power that thrummed beneath his skin, the strange, ancestral strength that surged with every breath. His mind was clear now, the visions of warriors and battles fading to the background as the realization of his heritage took center stage. But there was no more time for reflection. He could sense the danger closing in. The gang from the alley hadn't forgotten him. If anything, they had become more obsessed, more desperate to learn about the power he possessed. Jake, the leader, had been terrified, but fear, as Xavier knew all too well, often turned into obsession. He could already feel their eyes on him, shadowing him from every corner, waiting for an opportunity to strike. He arrived at the old warehouse near the docks, the place where his instincts told him he would face them. The building stood like a silent sentinel against the night, its windows boarded up and its steel doors rusted with age. It was the perfect location for a fight, isolated and forgotten. The perfect location for a showdown that Xavier couldn't avoid anymore. As he stepped into the warehouse, his senses sharpened. The stale air, the distant hum of machinery, the faint clinking of metal against concrete. All were too clear, too precise. His reflexes were faster than they had ever been. His heart beat in sync with the rhythm of his thoughts, calm and deliberate. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. Xavier. A voice called from the darkness, and Xavier turned to find Jake stepping forward, flanked by the same men who had tried to accost him in the alley. But now they were armed, crowbars, pipes, and other makeshift weapons clutched in their hands. Their eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of defiance and fear. You should have walked away when you had the chance, Jake sneered, his voice dripping with venom. But now we'll find out what makes you tick, what power you really have. Xavier didn't answer. His hand tightened into a fist, the power within him rising like a flood, ready to be unleashed. The mark on his neck seemed to glow faintly, its intricate symbols shimmering as if reacting to the danger in the air. His body tensed, every muscle coiled in anticipation. He was no longer just a man. He was the legacy of something greater. Jake's eyes darted to the tattoo again, and for a moment, there was a flicker of doubt. But then he shook his head, pushing his fear aside. "Take him down," he shouted, and the gang rushed forward, their weapons raised. Xavier moved first, a blur of motion that left the men scrambling. He dodged the first strike. A pipe swung toward his head and countered with a swift punch to the attacker's gut. The man crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. Another swung a crowbar at his side, but Xavier twisted, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it until the weapon clattered to the floor. The remaining gang members hesitated, shocked by how quickly their attacks were being neutralized. Jake snarled, drawing a knife from his belt, his grip tightening around the handle. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he growled. "You're just a freak. Someone who doesn't belong here." Xavier's gaze hardened as he stepped forward, his voice low but filled with power. You don't know anything about who I am. With a single motion, Xavier struck, his hand moving faster than Jake could react. He disarmed the leader with ease, knocking the knife from his hand and sending it clattering to the floor. Jake stumbled back, his eyes wide with disbelief. You don't get to decide who belongs where, Xavier continued, his voice steady, unyielding. Not anymore. Jake's bravado faltered. He was no longer the confident leader, the one who had picked on Xavier without a second thought. Now, he was just a man who realized the depths of his mistake. What are you? Jake whispered, fear creeping into his voice. Xavier didn't respond. Instead, he looked at the other gang members, who were still standing frozen in shock. He wasn't here to fight to the death. He was here to end this, once and for all. Leave, Xavier said, his voice commanding. Go back to wherever you came from. Walk away from this. And never come near me again. The gang members looked between each other, uncertainty and fear in their eyes. For a long moment, there was no sound but the heavy breathing of the men in the room. And then, one by one, they dropped their weapons, turning and fleeing into the shadows. Jake was the last to leave, his shoulders slumped, his defiance broken. Xavier stood alone in the warehouse, his heart still pounding in his chest, but the adrenaline slowly fading. He had faced them and he had won. But it wasn't just a victory over the gang. It was a victory over the fear that had once held him back. As the last echo of footsteps faded into the night, Xavier's gaze fell to the mark on his neck. It had stopped glowing, but he could feel its presence, the legacy of his ancestors still thrumming inside him. The battle had only just begun, and he was ready for whatever came next.